Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody that's hopefully for somebody. I am your host, Kyle Naranya, the Film Realist. Hope you are ready and excited for a first time on the podcast where instead of reviewing a film, which unfortunately I was unable to see, Killers of the Flower Moon, I will be reviewing a video game that I just recently finished, which is Marvel's Spider-Man 2 on the PlayStation 5, the long-awaited sequel to Spider-Man on the PS4 from 2018, as well as the continuation of the, I guess, spin-off of Spider-Man Miles Morales, which was a PlayStation 5 launch title. So if you have played all three of those games, there's probably going to be discussion on all three of them in general. As typical with a film review, I'm going to have a non-spoiler section of the review as well as a spoiler section of the review. So if you have not had a chance to finish the game, I will talk about generalities without any specific plot details. But if you have played it, or even if you haven't and you want to hear my thoughts on the overall plot, you can hear that in the spoilers. So let's jump into my non-spoiler thoughts for Insomniac's Marvel's Spider-Man 2 on the PlayStation 5. So this shouldn't be spoilers for the two previous games, but Marvel's Spider-Man 2 continues the storyline from the last two games, particularly kicking off from the Miles Morales spin-off that was great to have Miles Morales as his own character. My love for what Insomniac has already done with Spider-Man is, I would say, very high up there. The initial version of their Spider-Man with Yuri Lowenthal's portrayal, as well as the character of Peter Parker we did get, where he was 10 years into his career, I would put up on the Mount Rushmore of my favorite Spider-Man adaptations of all time, up with Andrew Garfield as my favorite live action, Spectacular Spider-Man as my favorite animated version, and then this, I don't know what the fourth version would be off the top of my head, but regardless, maybe probably the comic books, if I'm being totally honest. That would be my Mount Rushmore for Spider-Man. And my hype for this game was very high, and Insomniac certainly delivered a sequel that was 5 years if you're waiting from the original game, but if you did play Miles, it's only been 3, which is not a crazy length of time considering we've had 3 awesome Spider-Man games in the span of 5 years. This Insomniac, as a first-party developer for Sony, has only continued to progress and make better games as time has gone on. If you played Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, you know what I'm talking about. And so the expectations for this was very, very high, particularly with the fact that, unlike the first game, the Insomniac in the marketing materials put it forward that we were going to get Kraven as a villain and we were going to get Venom. The marketing for the first game, if you were unaware, really leaned into that Mr. Negative narrative and did not let us know at all that a different villain. You know what? Sorry. Spider-Man 1 came out 5 years ago. So spoilers for Spider-Man 1 right here. If you don't want to know, skip this part, where Doc Ock wound up being the final villain of that game. And so anticipation for this was slightly different just based on the fact that we did know who the two villains were going to be for the whole narrative. And without getting into any specific plot details, I do think that hurts the game to a minor degree in that if you understand any story structure, this game's plot is more predictable in that nature, in that you know ultimately who the final conclusion is going to be against. And I'm not going to say who it is, but it's easier to figure out once you know the particulars of who the main antagonists are in the game. Now, that is not to be overly critical of this game because I absolutely loved it. I was able to get about 3 to 4 hour play sessions in over the weekend to complete the main story. I have not platinumed the game or 100%ed it. I plan on doing that because I platinumed the 2 previous games and I really enjoy playing these games even in New Game Plus mode. The integration of the 2 Spider-Man stories in the narrative works out really, really well in where you get the focus on both of them. Now, this Peter Parker being the quote-unquote titular Spider-Man, if you want to argue that amongst the 2 games, does get more to do, but overall, their relationship and the continual development of their partnership as the Spider-Man for New York is something I really enjoyed and really shows Peter Parker in this mentor role that is so rare for the webhead in general. In the typical Miles comic book storylines, his version of Peter is dead. And it's only been more recently when they integrated Miles out of the Ultimate Universe that we did get to see their interactions. But outside of the comic books and the two Spider-Verse films, which really clearly are doing their own thing, oh, that would have to be it. Favorite Spider-Man movies. There we go. It's the Spider-Verse films. Across the Spider-Verse, if I had to pick one between the two of them. So that's my Mount Rushmore. I'll make a picture of that. But continuing that storyline with the two of them, I think Brian Intihar and Ryan Smith really understood the mission of this game, which was because of the power of the PlayStation 5 and having the ability to focus on a much grander story, that they certainly do that. And the jaw-dropping spectacles that this game is able to present. This is in a trailer that was released recently, so this is not a spoiler. But the fight with Sandman and being able to be two different Spider-Men and their variety of skills is really cool. Obviously, you have the invisibility and the venom or electrical attacks from Miles, so he has a specific part of the fight that's important to him. But also integrating the web wings in the traversal system. When you weave that in with Insomniac's incredible web slinging mechanics in this game, you can go so fast. I wouldn't know exactly how to clock the overall speed, whether that's in miles or kilometers an hour, but I'm sure somebody more smarter than I will figure that out. But my goodness, you can move across what is twice as big a New York City because of the different neighborhoods that they've added into the game. But even crossing water, you can get across from island or each parts of the island much faster than you could move in the initial two games. And the web wings in general really do remind me of the traversal that we got from Batman Arkham Asylum and Batman Arkham City. There's been some comparisons to those two games, and while I really did enjoy the Rocksteady versions of those games, I think the integration of weapons into combat has been something I've really enjoyed in the mechanics in all of these games in general, and the way that you are able to weave those so seamlessly into the combat allows for you to get such significantly high combos, which allows for specific takedowns and whatnot. And the new tech involved with both of the characters is really cool, particularly all the different symbiote attacks that you do get in the game, as well as some of the more mechanical attacks you get from Peter. I know that you do see the extra 4 arms from the Iron Spider / Doc Ock inspiration, which I find really interesting. Now, that never necessarily comes up in narrative. This is not a spoiler because it doesn't happen, and I found that to be really interesting that that's not addressed. But overall, the portrayal of these characters and the level of depth and emotion you are able to get from a Spider-Man who's been doing this for over a decade at this point and having this mentor in his life be gone, and that he is now that mentor with a fully fledged Spider-Man who did previously have his own adventure, gives a dichotomy, or sorry, not a dichotomy, but a level of interaction and relationship that you typically don't get from really any versions of superheroes. Batman, in most versions of the character, he is the mentor and he is far superior than Robin or even Nightwing, Batgirl, or Batwing, whoever he may be having interactions with. And I really enjoyed the story that this game has to, wow, I'm very tired and I apologize. But that this franchise has to tell, where the level of maturity that these characters are handled with, that they are dealing with significant events of trauma that we did see in the 2 previous games, particularly in Marvel's Spider-Man 1 or Spider-Man PS4 as it's known public or socially, I guess. And this game's plot points really do deal with the traumatic events that Miles and Peter have had to deal with and how that puts strain on their relationship and to the relationship particularly Peter has with other people, knowing, again, this is in the marketing material for this, that he does get the black suit. And if you have ever seen a Spider-Man thing, you know that the symbiote emphasizes your worst emotions, negative feelings towards others around you, because it's all about we and us and them being one symbiotic relationship, pun intended, I guess. And the mystery of who Venom is may not be surprising to most, but overall, the way that that character is integrated into a story with Kraven, I really enjoyed, given the fact that also from another standpoint, we get another compelling main antagonist for a large percentage of the game, similar to how we got a really well in-depth story from both Mr. Negative and, spoilers for Spider-Man PS4, from Doc Ock, and how these characters are not one note at all, and we get dimension and their motivation throughout the story, and how that connects to this one is these stories continue. It's not just another chapter, it is a continuation of that overall story introduced in the two previous games, which I really did enjoy. Again, the action in these games is so much fun, and it is the closest you can get to being a superhero. I thoroughly enjoy being able to weave my gadgets, and I know I said this already, in through combat, and the fact that you get to spend time as Peter and Miles, I think also adds a complete perspective that you wouldn't get from typically one of these characters. Miles representing the minority standpoint, him being Latino and a Black American, and then getting Peter, who comes from, while yes, he is a cisgender white male, he's coming from a lot of this being an economic standpoint, and that everyone he's ever cared about, he's lost around them, and that to some degree affects his relationships with the Black Suit as well as everybody else in this story. And we do get more elements into understanding Peter, particularly with Harry being in the picture, which again is in the trailers for this. And so I've been going back and forth on whether I think this game is better than the first one. And I think it's unfortunate that because the first game was such a refresh and reintroduction to Spider-Man in video games, it holds a special place in my heart. But the more I've thought about it, I think I enjoyed Spider-Man 2 more, even though it might be slightly shorter a game. You'd have to look up specifically the length of the plot. But overall, you get a massive story with huge stakes and scope that you don't necessarily get in the first one. And I'm already looking forward to playing through it again, because the ultimate conclusion of this game and where it leaves Peter and Miles is a place we haven't really seen from them before in any version of the character in at least mass media movies and TV and cartoons. So I'm really looking forward to my new game plus play of the game. I'm really looking forward to what I'm assuming will eventually be Spider-Man 3, or if we get a spinoff before that, I don't know. Insomniac hasn't announced anything yet. This game did sell massively well in the 24 hours it was released, selling 2.5 million copies, being the fastest selling first-party title in PlayStation history. So expecting big things from this, I think, is fair. While the story may not be, in my opinion, as original as the first one, it took really significant storylines from Kraven and Venom and wove them together, I think, really effectively with our two leads of Miles and Peter. So if you're looking forward to this and you're excited for it, I definitely recommend you picking this up. I think if you don't have a PlayStation 5 and you aren't sure, I think it's worth buying a PlayStation 5 for alone buying the Miles Morales the Miles Morales Deluxe Edition, which I'm know still includes Spider-Man Remastered, which was a PS5 refresh of the game, or even buying those two games individually and then being able to play this as a sort of trilogy, I think would be a thoroughly enjoying experience, not to mention as somebody who really does enjoy first party story based games from Sony, this was another hit. And I think it is well-deserved all of the accolades and critical reception it is getting. So that will do it for my non-spoiler section of the review. I'm going to be getting into plot details and specifics, so if you do not want that spoiled for yourself, check out now, jump onto the outro so you can find out what I'm reviewing next week. If you're ready, let's get into Venom. All right, so as I hinted in the non-spoiler section of the review, this does weave the Venom storyline with the Kraven storyline. We get to see a significant amount of flashbacks, which I think really does help delve into Harry and Peter's relationship. Harry being a character who we only ever saw in a tank in the first game with the symbiote. Again, this is the full spoilers. Harry does become Venom. I don't think the game otherwise would have time to introduce another character who would eventually become Venom. And this being what I believe is the first time Harry Osborn has ever been Venom, it is certainly a unique thing and an element that we had not seen before. And this character portraying Venom, or Harold Osborn in something else. What is this? Oh, it's the Ultimate Universe? I don't know. That is not a show that I remember thoroughly well. Regardless, the the relationship between Harry and Peter, I think, is explored really uniquely, and we are not given the relationship where their parents knew each other and whatnot. They were friends of high school, and one character who seemed, or their, while we get to see a bunch of their high school interactions, we don't really get to see their high school experience, which is something I do feel a little bit missed opportunity, given how we see Peter as a 25-year-old, and then I'm guessing he's probably 15, give or take, in the high school flashbacks. We don't get to see Liz Allen or potentially Gwen Stacy. We don't see any of his other love interests who may be coming up in the future, but who knows. And so Kraven's storyline throughout this game is pretty much baked in Kraven's last hunt, which I find really interesting, that he has hunted every significant, whether that's a bounty hunter or creature. And what's most interesting to me is he's not initially after Spider-Man. He's after the different animalistic based villains of Spider-Man. And throughout the beginning of the game sees that, well, no, Spider-Man is the real alpha, particularly when we do see Peter eventually get the black suit, which we learn was obviously a meteorite that fell from space, but that the symbiote was given to Harry by Dr. Connors, who was working for Norman Osborn to heal some sort of disease that Harry has inherited from his mother. An element that's been a more recent adaptation to the Osborn storyline. It was famously adapted into Amazing Spider-Man 2, and that was an element that I really liked. These games, like my favorite versions of the Spider-Man character, have integrated plot points or specific details from other versions. Spectacular Spider-Man is famous for taking elements of the films and the comics and weaving them into, in my opinion, the best version of Spider-Man, period. But regardless, we get to see the continued evolution of all of the relationships with these characters. The game is apparently, I didn't know this, but 10 months post Miles Morales, and Peter and Miles are both being Amazing Spider-Man. Genki and Haley and even Rio, Miles' mother, are in on the whole thing, which the whole Spider-Man thing, and Mary Jane Watson, really interestingly, dichotomy to the usual Spider-Man story, is actually working at the Daily Bugle. Peter Parker has no association with the school, with the Daily Bugle currently anyways. And he attempts to be a teacher at Miles' school at Visions. That obviously doesn't go well because Peter Parker, in typical fashion, can never hold down a job. And so we get to see this relationship history with Harry as we get to see Harry's eventual reveal that the symbiote is giving him superpowers. So we almost get a version of Agent Venom, which is really cool. And ultimately, we see elements where the symbiote is clearly attracted to Peter. One thing that I found interesting is typically in the history of the symbiote, which was actually created, I believe, in the original Secret Wars, which was that it got all of its powers, specifically the ones that we know that Spider-Man is capable of, from him. So we see elements of super strength and some tendriling traversal before it attaches to Peter, but it's attracted to Peter and clearly wants something to do with his powers. And so eventually, and this was a scene that I did not see coming. I thought potentially something was going to happen to Harry earlier in the game and result in Peter getting it. But no, Peter, in one of his first interactions with Kraven, is mortally injured. He is stabbed by Kraven, and it is at that point that the symbiote releases off of Harry and then goes to Peter, and thus everyone's favorite black-suited Spider-Man begins, and he just becomes progressively worse and worse and worse as things go on. He still, in his mind, wants to do what's right and becomes very jaded to everybody around him, and I found that really interesting, that he has this ticking clock about Harry being around and or having a ticking time bomb on Harry's illness, and that being the focus for everything that he's doing. But regardless, he is continuing to just become angry and angrier, like a black suited symbiote Spider-Man typically would become. And so his relationship with Miles gets really fractured at that point, where Miles, this is not the guy he wants to be. And even Rio says that to Peter, like, Miles so desperately wants to be the best Spider-Man because of you. And that all of these characters just saying Peter is capable of being such a great hero, and hearing what he has become is affecting him wholly throughout the whole thing. And brain is mush. What happens? Ultimately, yeah, sorry. You get to, in interactions with Kraven, you also get to see through the other villains. I didn't want to lose this because this is earlier in the game, where Martin Lee is like some of the other villains who are eventually offed by Kraven, has much more of a redemptive arc in this game. And of course, he is responsible for the death of Miles Morales' father, Jefferson Davis. And Miles so easily could fall down the path of revenge and gets very close to that. And I really appreciated that while we have Peter in the black suit, it would be so easy for Miles to also fall down that as kind of like an evil sidekick to some degree. But ultimately he doesn't, because of the relationships he has, particularly with Rio and everybody else around him, and chooses to be the better man. And the fight that he has with Martin Lee in Kraven's almost Thunderdome is really cool. And I enjoyed getting to see another fight with that villain. There aren't any fights with any of the other villains. I might be wrong about that, but I don't think so. You don't fight Electro, you don't fight Vulture, you don't fight Scorpion, and you don't fight Doc Ock. And am I missing one? I don't think so. No. You get to see Mysterio in this to some degree, which is cool, with one of the side missions, particularly with like a Coney Island DJ fight, which is really awesome. There is more Mary Jane missions, but I think they're much more integrated into the game. And given the fact that she gets a taser gun, you can be a lot more hands-on with these fight scenes as opposed to just having to sneak around the whole time. So I'm glad that she still does have some agency in it. And Mary Jane's character is clearly so important to Peter, being his love interest, and her dealing with the repercussions of her wanting to stay employed and be the journalist that she wants to be, puts how would I phrase this? It puts a barrier between her and Peter, and adds to the fuel that Peter, particularly when the black suit is on him, that he feels completely alone. And Peter, particularly dealing with the death of Aunt May, being one of the reasons he thinks he needs the black suit, because he was not able to save everyone. And each of these characters dealing with the trauma from the first games adds a level of maturity and depth that we don't normally get to have. I think most people would say that it's normal for us to see the down and out Spider-Man, but really to see somebody rise metaphorically from the ashes of their trauma is something I really like getting to see. It's not flash in the pan stuff. We got to witness the death of Aunt May, which outside of No Way Home, I had never witnessed before in a adaptation of the character. So it was such a heart-wrenching and gut-wrenching performance, particularly from Yuri Lowenthal in that scene in the first game, that still being or holding a toll on Peter certainly makes sense as to why one of the ways that the black symbiote was able to get its tendrils into Peter and control him. And as Peter does have the suit, we do get to see that Harry is starting to resent Peter. Norman loves Peter. The black suit makes Peter better. And I think this is one of the elements of the game that they don't hit out of the park, which is, I don't feel that his hatred for Peter is overall earned the same degree you would get from somebody like Eddie Brock, who doesn't, at the end of the day, know Peter the way that Harry does. We're not given this interaction where he was always jealous of Peter, or that Peter had this relationship with Norman that he could never have. And obviously the symbiote brings out your worst possible elements of your personality, but ultimately I think it's just the symbiote is just trying to take over the world, which is very reminiscent of Spider-Man Web of Shadows, which by the very end of the game you pretty much have, which I found really interesting. I did not expect the game to go to this scope of taking over New York with symbiote monsters everywhere. And as somebody who really liked Spider-Man Web of Shadows, which had something this game, hit my mic, has something this game doesn't have where you could make morality choices. It was really cool to get to see that. And man, fighting the other symbiote creatures is difficult. One element I do like about the game is particularly when you can free roam later on, where you can choose to be in the symbiote costume, which has its own particular skills or mini moves, as well as if you're in a regular Spider-Man costume, you get the additional arms and whatnot and what they're capable of doing. But an element that I did like was that the fact that Martin Lee and Miles eventually have to work together to free Peter of the symbiote or any traces left of it in his psyche. And something I was not expecting at all, which is it gives him the birth of the anti-venom suit, which is like a white symbiote costume for good. And it gives Peter these abilities that are essentially able to pull people out of the control of symbiotes. And where that comes particularly in handy is something I did not see coming whatsoever, which is that Venom ultimately takes over Mary Jane, and we get to see a version of Scream, one of the other symbiote characters. And that fight, particularly with my brain just turned to mush, where we get to see Mary Jane as a symbiote character, and the relationship really just being shown straight in your face, like why she feels the way that she does, and Peter feeling so broken for how he has completely ignored what Mary Jane was going through. And similar to something in Spider-Man 3, but I would say that I think it's handled significantly better in this film. And otherwise, getting ultimately to have to save the city. My favorite aspect of this game is the final missions, where we get to see Spider-Man fight Venom. We get to see Miles fight, or before that, you got to see Miles fight black-suited Peter, which was a phenomenal fight, and really showing that Miles on his own right can be the Spider-Man to save the city. And I would say pretty much did, given the fact that he had to save Peter. But having Miles, Peter, and Mary Jane work as a trio to ultimately save the city, destroy the meteorite, and try to save Harry from the symbiote, which Kurt Connors tells him is very unlikely, and Norman just begging Spider-Man to save Peter Parker. Again, this was an element that I was unfortunately really early on able to predict, which was that something was going to happen to Harry that was going to result in Norman probably going down the route of Green Goblin, and we do get to see a G formula teased, so I'd be shocked. There's the three major villains of Spider-Man, in my opinion, are Venom, Doc Ock, and Green Goblin. So safe assumption that we're going to get Green Goblin in Spider-Man 3. Who the other villain would be for that, I'm not really sure. But anyways, having what feels like a blockbuster finale in this video game form was incredible, particularly getting to use all of Miles's Venom abilities and him being just as much responsible for the saving of New York, which ultimately leads to the conclusion, which is that Peter is burnt out trying to be a successful Peter Parker and a Spider-Man, and has completely let Peter be by the wayside and has only really been focused on being a Spider-Man. And at this point is retiring from being Spider-Man so that way he can continue the Emily May Foundation, which was started by Harry, who is in essentially a comatose state by the end of this game, which is why Norman's so pissed off. And if Norman, who eventually goes to visit Doc Ock at the end of the game in prison, which is really cool. And so Miles is going to be the sole Spider-Man for the city. It'll be really interesting to see if they do pull Peter out of retirement. Cindy Moon, who is Silk, was introduced at the very end of this game, so I'm curious to see how they're going to weave that in. She is somebody who, from just a pheromone meta-human level, is able to attract Peter Parker as essentially a mate. So what's that going to mean for his relationship with Mary Jane? I don't know, but I'm excited to see. I really hope some way they are able to integrate Spider-Gwen, Gwen Stacy into this universe, because then you would have the trio of incredible spider people. It'd be amazing to have Spectacular Ultimate. It'd be whatever, use whatever Spider-Man pun you want to use, but I really enjoyed this game, and the more I talk about it, I think the more I'm realizing I liked it. It gives a full, in-depth analysis of our main leads and continues the story that was so well laid out from the previous two, and it's the jumping off point for Spider-Man 3 is unlike anything we've really seen before. Spider-Man so rarely retires. We do get the no more Spider-Man storyline, but this is different. This is coming from success and Peter trying to be Peter. And I don't think he's giving up being Spider-Man. He doesn't say that. He says he's taking a break. But ultimately, Spider-Man 3 could be a really interesting game and exploring avenues that we haven't seen before. And while I did probably sound a little bit critical of things we had seen before, but the portrayal of Kraven and Venom, Tony Todd as Venom, absolutely incredible. And everyone else involved in this game delivered a phenomenal sequel that I think carries the legacy of the two previous Insomniac games. And the fact that they're also making a Wolverine game, Insomniac just keeps crushing it, and this is another home run. So that will do it for my spoiler review of Marvel's Spider-Man 2 on the PlayStation 5. If you played it, if you beat it, let me know what you thought about it. You can tweet at me, Kyle_Naranja. That's Noronha. Or you can tweet at Film Realist, of course. Film Realist is on all the social medias. You can see all the fun promotional clips on there as well. I'm going to end the spoilers so I can tell you what's coming up next week. All right, next week, I am going to be doing a couple things. There may be a special episode. I'm not going to tell you what that is, but in terms of reviews, I will finally be reviewing the 30th and final season of Power Rangers. That's Power Rangers Cosmic Fury that debuted on Netflix, I guess just about a month ago. That concludes the 30-year-long continuity. I will be hopefully joined by a special guest. You'll have to find out when you listen to that episode. So that episode will hopefully be released on schedule. I apologize for the delay, but my gameplay time was significantly limited based on my real job, which is on the weekend being a dad. So I played when my kids slept, and I also need to sleep, so I could not play all night long. But regardless, I did finish the main story for Spider-Man 2, as you just heard. Please leave a comment on the social media or a 5-star review on the podcast platforms. And if you're listening on Spotify, there's always a question of the week embedded into the episode. I'd love to see what your answers are. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, and I hope to see you next week for my review of Power Rangers Cosmic Fury. I hope it's more phenomenal. This has been Kyle Naranja, the Film Realist. I'll see you next time.